The wind carried the scent of dust and old sorrow across the open stretch of land, a thin veil that settled on every wooden porch and rusted hinge of the quiet town. The house at the edge of the prairie stood like a forgotten prayer, its walls weathered and bent from too many winters and too few hands to mend them. Inside, a woman sat on the rough-hewn floorboards, her back pressed to the wall, breath shallow as if she feared even the air would betray her. 2 newborns lay against her chest, their cries small, tremulous threads of life in a world that had already decided they were burdens. The door slammed open, rattling the frame. Heavy boots struck the floor, each step a verdict. Her late husband's brother stood there, eyes sharp as a blade dulled by anger and pride. Behind him, the sister-in-law's voice cut through the stale air like a rusted knife, shrill and cruel. 2 girls. 2 mouths. Nothing but trouble. Words spat like tobacco, sticking to the woman's skin. She gathered the twins closer, feeling their tiny fists curl as if they sensed the storm surrounding them. She didn't speak. Words had long since lost their power in this house. Her husband's death had taken the last of them, leaving only silence and duty and the cold hands of those who saw her as property to be managed, not a soul to be cherished. The first strike came fast, a backhand that tasted of metal and humiliation. Her head snapped to the side, but she made no sound. The babies whimpered, soft cries muffled against her dress. The second blow was worse, not for the pain but for the way it landed across the curve of the infant she shielded, a reminder that her body was no longer her own. It was armor now, and armor must not break. Outside, the world remained indifferent. The sky was the pale gray of unspoken grief, the earth dry and cracking under the weight of another season with no rain. Far in the distance, the sound of hooves broke the monotony, a lone rider cutting across the horizon like a moving shadow. He had no business stopping. The man on the horse had learned long ago to keep his head down, his heart quieter still. Yet the faint, fragile sound of a baby's cry carried on the wind, weaving through the emptiness until it reached him. He slowed, reined in the horse, listening. That sound didn't belong to the open plains. It belonged to a home, to safety. But what he heard beneath it wasn't safety at all. He turned the horse toward the house, each hoofbeat measured, deliberate. As he drew closer, the noise sharpened, the harsh bite of voices, the sickening thud of flesh against flesh. His jaw tightened. Inside, the widow held her ground, though her body trembled beneath the weight of blows and curses. One twin had gone silent, the other whimpered as if pleading with the world to be gentle just this once. She whispered to them both, words soft as rain against dry earth. Mama's here. Mama won't let go. The door opened again, but this time no boot kicked it wide. It moved slowly, a creak announcing an intruder neither expected. The in-laws froze mid-gesture, their hands still raised like evidence of their own cruelty. Dust floated in the sunlight that spilled through the doorway, framing the man who stepped inside. He wasn't dressed like a savior. No polished boots or shining badge. Just worn denim, a sweat-stained hat, and the quiet weight of someone who carried his own ghosts. His eyes swept the room, lingering on the twins clutched to the woman's chest, then rising to meet hers. Something passed between them, not rescue, not yet. Recognition, perhaps, the kind that exists between two people who have both known loss deep enough to carve hollows in the soul. The brother-in-law's voice broke the silence, thick with false bravado. "Ain't none of your business, stranger." The man didn't answer. He stepped farther in, the boards beneath him groaning under his weight. The air shifted, the violence curling back on itself in the presence of something steady, unyielding. The widow couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her cheek burned, her arms ached, but her grip on her daughters never loosened. She stared at the man, searching for threat and finding only a strange, quiet resolve. He looked at her for a long moment, as though deciding something not with his mind but with the marrow of his bones. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a promise he hadn't yet made but knew he would keep. "You're coming with me." The room seemed to inhale and hold its breath. The in-laws sputtered, words tripping over their own fear disguised as rage. The woman blinked, stunned, her lips parting though no sound emerged. He extended a hand, not commanding, not begging, just there, open and patient. Behind him, the open door let in the scent of the prairie, the possibility of something beyond these walls of cruelty. For the first time in months, she let herself imagine a different life. Not safe, not happy, not yet, but different. Her fingers shifted slightly against the twins, their warmth grounding her in the moment as tears she hadn't known she held slipped soundlessly down her cheeks. The in-laws shouted, a clamor of protest, but their voices felt far away now, like echoes in an empty canyon. The only sound that mattered was the faint coo of her babies and the steady rhythm of the man's breath, a promise disguised as something ordinary. Her body swayed, not from weakness but from the pull of choice. Every part of her had been bound to this place by grief and fear, and now a stranger's quiet words had cut through those chains like the first strike of an axe against old wood. She met his eyes again, searching for deceit, for pity, for anything that might tell her this was just another cruelty in softer skin. But all she saw was steadiness, the kind that held up a roof through a storm. Her lips trembled as she drew in a breath that tasted of both terror and hope. The man's hand remained, waiting. The babies shifted against her chest, one letting out a tiny, plaintive cry as if urging her forward. And for the first time since the world had taken everything from her, she moved. Not away from pain but toward the fragile, impossible promise of something better. She reached. The cabin smelled of pine and smoke, the kind of scent that clung to the bones of a place long lived in. Its walls were not grand, only sturdy, built by hands that valued shelter over show. The man led her inside without speaking, his boots quiet against the worn floorboards. He set down his hat on a crooked nail by the door and stepped aside as though to say this is not a cage, only a roof. She hesitated on the threshold, the twins shifting in her arms, their soft breaths warming the hollow between her collarbones. The room was simple, one table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall. A fire hummed low in the hearth, its light licking at the edges of shadows. Safety didn't roar here, it whispered. He moved slowly, each gesture deliberate so as not to startle her. A kettle was placed near the flames. A blanket, rough but clean, folded over the back of the chair closest to the fire. He spoke at last, his voice quiet, shaped by solitude. You can sit. Rest them, Her knees ached to fold, but suspicion kept her spine straight. Kindness had teeth in her world. She edged forward, settling into the chair with a caution born of too many betrayals. The twins stirred, one releasing a faint, hungry cry. She hushed them with murmured promises, though her own lips trembled against the words. The man crouched near the hearth, the glow painting his face in soft amber. Lines cut deep into his skin, not from cruelty but from weather and grief. He poured hot water into a chipped mug, added milk with the ease of habit, and slid it across the table toward her. Their fingers did not touch, but the heat of the cup seeped into her palms like something alive. Silence grew between them, but not the heavy kind that strangles. This one was tentative, curious, the sound of 2 worlds circling each other without colliding. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind carried the faint creak of trees swaying against the dark. When he finally spoke again, his words were not questions, only statements offered gently into the space between them. You've been hurt. She stiffened, a reflex. Then, after a beat, she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. It's nothing new. Her voice was raw from disuse, a thread pulled too thin. He nodded, as though her truth was not something to argue with or fix, only witness. He turned his attention to the twins, their small faces flushed with the effort of living. His hand hovered briefly before pulling back, respecting a boundary that needed no words. They'll need names, he said softly, not to her so much as to the quiet air that wrapped around them all. Her chest tightened. The twins had been born nameless, their first breaths met with scorn instead of celebration. She whispered the names now, tasting them aloud for the first time, as if speaking them might anchor her daughters to the earth. Lydia. Rose. He repeated them under his breath, the syllables careful and reverent, as though he were handling something sacred. Time shifted inside that cabin, not fast or slow but in the way a seed knows when to push through soil. Days began to layer over one another. The widow learned the pattern of the man's quiet, the way he rose before dawn to split wood, the steady rhythm of his hands repairing what the world broke. He spoke little, but his actions filled the gaps words often failed to bridge. She, in turn, began to let the edges of her fear soften. The twins grew stronger, their cries turning into small declarations of life. Sometimes she'd catch the man standing in the doorway, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not longing, not exactly joy. Something deeper, stitched from old wounds and cautious hope. One evening, rain swept across the plains, drumming against the roof like a heartbeat. She sat by the fire, rocking Lydia while Rose slept in a basket lined with flannel. The man sat opposite, mending a saddle strap, the steady pull of leather through his hands a quiet counterpoint to the storm outside. Without looking up, he said, "You don't have to stay if you don't want to." The words hit her like a sudden gust, knocking loose something buried. She stared at him, searching his face for mockery or hidden demand, but found only honesty. She realized then what had unsettled her most since stepping into this cabin. He had given her safety without ownership, kindness without a price. It was a language she barely understood. "I don't know where else to go," she admitted, voice trembling under the weight of truth. He looked at her then, really looked, his gaze not piercing but steady, as if to anchor her against the storm raging outside and inside alike. "Then stay as long as you need." Something inside her shifted, subtle as the first green shoot in spring. Not trust, not yet, but the faint stirring of roots testing soil. The town, of course, had eyes and tongues. Whispers crawled through saloon corners and church pews. A widow and a man living under the same roof. Stories always grow in the gaps where facts can't reach. She heard the murmurs on her first trip into town with him, felt the weight of stares like prying fingers. But when she glanced at him, his face betrayed nothing. He carried their supplies and her daughters with the same quiet steadiness, his silence louder than their judgment. It was on their way back that she noticed the horse tracks in the mud near the property's edge. Too many to belong to one rider. Her stomach nodded. She didn't mention it. Not yet. That night, as the twins slept and the fire burned low, she found herself standing at the window, staring into the dark. The rain had stopped, but the land held a strange stillness, the kind that comes before something breaks. Behind her, the man's voice cut through the quiet, calm but edged with steel. "They'll come for you." She turned, heart lurching. He was sitting in the chair by the fire, eyes fixed on the door as if he could already hear footsteps approaching. "But they won't take you." The words landed heavy, not as comfort but as promise, and for the first time since she'd fled that broken house, she felt the fragile thrum of defiance stirring beneath her fear. Spring crept onto the land like a hesitant guest, brushing the prairie with soft green and the scent of wet earth. The cabin breathed easier in the new season, its walls no longer groaning under winter's weight. The twins had grown into louder lives, their cries bolder, their laughter just beginning to spill into the air like tiny bells. In that sound, the woman found pieces of herself she thought had died the night her husband was buried. The man moved through the days with the same quiet steadiness, his work shaping the land into something livable. Fences rose again, mended under his patient hands. He spoke little, but she had begun to learn his language anyway. The way he left the fire warm for her when she woke at night to feed the girls, the way his steps softened when he passed their sleeping forms, the way he offered space without abandoning the room. She had learned his name in whispers, not from his lips but from the old neighbor who brought flour and salt. Daniel. It fit him, a name solid and unadorned, as if carved straight from the earth. She said it once when he wasn't looking, testing it in the quiet of the cabin. The sound felt strange and safe all at once. In the slow rhythm of days, something gentle began to bloom, not love but the soil where it might someday grow. Trust, fragile as a sapling testing the air. It showed itself in moments. Her laughter, quick and startled, when Rose grabbed his beard with her tiny fist. His stillness the first time she placed Lydia in his arms without hesitation. The world outside their walls felt far away, a place that had no claim on them yet. But safety is a delicate thing, always aware of the footsteps that might shatter it. The first sign came in the form of a rider's shadow passing too close to the cabin one afternoon. She saw it through the thin curtain, the curve of a man's hat, the gleam of eyes that lingered a second too long. Daniel noticed too. He said nothing, but that night he moved the rifle from its place above the hearth to the corner nearest the door. Rain came again a few days later, soft and warm, the kind that turns dirt to clay and makes the air smell alive. The twins slept to its rhythm, their small chests rising and falling against the lullaby of water. She sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching Daniel repair a broken bridle. The light made his face look younger, though his eyes held the weight of years that no season could wash away. She found herself speaking without planning to. "I used to dream of running," she said, voice low. Far away with him. Before he changed. Daniel didn't look up, his hands steady on the leather. "Where would you have gone?" She smiled faintly, though it held no joy. "Anywhere that wasn't here." He nodded as if that answer was enough. Maybe it was. After a long moment, he said, "I used to dream of staying. Of having a place no one could take away." Their eyes met then, a brief, quiet crossing of lives. There was no promise in it, no sudden swell of romance. Only the understanding that both had been wandering different kinds of deserts, searching for water in the same empty sky. Days passed, each one folding into the next like pages in a well-worn diary. The twins began to babble, their voices turning the cabin into something warmer than walls and wood. She caught herself humming again, old lullabies her mother once sang. Daniel would pause when he heard them, his face softening into something almost tender before he turned away. It was late one evening, the sun bleeding into the horizon, when the quiet they had built cracked. Daniel returned from the edge of the property, his boots heavy with mud, his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. "They're closer," he said simply. Her stomach clenched. She didn't ask who. She already knew. He set the saddle down harder than necessary, a rare flash of something sharp in his movements. They've been circling for days. Trying to see if you'll run, She held the twins tighter, as if her arms could build a fortress the walls could not. "What if they don't stop this time?" Daniel looked at her then, the weight of his gaze anchoring her to the moment. "Then we make them." The words were not loud, but they carried the solidity of stone. For the first time since she'd met him, she heard the echo of fire in his voice. Not violence, not rage, just a promise that if the world came to take what little they'd built, it would have to fight the earth itself to do it. That night she couldn't sleep. The twins stirred, their small breaths brushing against her skin like questions she couldn't answer. She rose quietly, moving to the window. The prairie stretched out silver under the moon, vast and empty, yet every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Behind her, the floor creaked. Daniel stood near the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the dying fire. He didn't speak, only walked past her to the window, his presence a shield she didn't know she'd been desperate for. "If they come," she whispered, "they'll take me. They'll take them, Daniel's hand rested lightly on the windowsill, his voice low enough to almost blend with the wind. "They'll have to go through me first." She turned her face toward him, studying the hard lines softened by moonlight. In his eyes, she didn't see the promise of rescue. She saw something rarer. A man who wouldn't let her fight alone. For the first time, The fear that had lived under her skin for months shifted, making room for something else. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was the shape of it, a shadow of what safety might one day feel like. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hooves across the darkened land. The twins stirred, and Daniel's head turned sharply toward the sound. He reached for the rifle without a word. Dawn came pale and thin, stretching light over the prairie like a trembling hand. The cabin felt different that morning, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She woke to the sound of boots outside, slow and deliberate, crunching over dry earth. The twins stirred against her chest, their soft weight both anchor and burden. Daniel was already at the door, rifle cradled in his arms, his face calm in that steady way of his, though his shoulders carried the quiet tension of a man who knew storms were best met standing. She rose, every muscle tight, her heart pounding not for herself, but for the tiny lives clinging to her warmth. The knock came, not a rap but a demand, the sound of fists that believed they owned what waited inside. Daniel didn't flinch. He opened the door with measured patience, letting the morning air sweep in along with the men. Her brother-in-law stepped forward first, his mouth already curling into accusation. Behind him, 2 other men she recognized from the edges of her husband's funeral, eyes sharp with judgment. The woman stayed back, her thin lips pursed in satisfaction, as if the sight of her cornered prey filled her with righteousness. "You've got no right to keep her here," the brother-in-law spat, his gaze sliding past Daniel to land on her and the babies. "Those are our blood. She don't get to run." Daniel's voice was low, almost gentle. "She didn't run. She was dragged." The words hit like a slap, the truth too plain to argue with, but the man tried anyway, puffing his chest, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his belt though he didn't draw. "You don't understand. Girls like that, they bring ruin. 2 at once? It's a curse." The twins whimpered at the raised voices, their cries breaking through the air like fragile glass. She felt something rise in her then, sharp and hot, a tide long held back by fear. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but loud enough to fill the cabin. "They are not a curse. They are mine." The room stilled. Even the fire seemed to pause. Her arms tightened around her daughters, their tiny fingers curling into her dress as if they heard the claim in her words. She had been silent for so long, letting others define her worth, her children. But in that moment, her voice felt like a blade carving her own name back into the world. The brother-in-law's sneer faltered, then twisted into anger. "You think you get to decide? You think you get to keep them when you can't even feed yourself without some man's charity?" Daniel moved then, not quickly, just a single step that placed him between her and them. His rifle stayed low, unthreatening, but his presence was a wall. "She's not alone," he said simply, and somehow those 3 words carried more weight than any shouted threat could. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement outside. The old neighbor had come, drawn by the voices, and behind him a few more townsfolk lingered, curiosity mixing with quiet disapproval. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, the weight of community pressing against the cabin walls. The brother-in-law's voice wavered now, though he tried to steady it. "This ain't over. They belong to us." "No," Daniel said, his voice so calm it cut through the air like the edge of a knife. "They belong to her." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even angry. It was fact, spoken the way one might speak of rain falling or the sun rising. And in that steady tone, something shifted. The men glanced at one another, at the growing number of eyes outside. Power built on fear always trembles when the world starts to watch. The woman stepped closer, her legs unsteady but her voice firm now, stronger with every word. "You can't have them. You can't touch them. Not ever again." Her brother-in-law's hand twitched again, and for one terrible second the world narrowed to the breath between violence and restraint. Then Daniel's voice broke it, soft but edged with steel. "Don't." The silence after that word was heavy as stone. The man's hand dropped. His eyes burned with a rage that had nothing left to hold on to. He spat in the dirt and turned away, his boots stomping out defeat against the earth. The others followed, their whispers thin with retreat. The door closed slowly behind them. The cabin exhaled. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, the twins pressed tight against her as tears she hadn't allowed in months broke free, hot and shaking. She wasn't crying from fear. Not this time. It was release, a flood after a long drought. Daniel knelt beside her, his hands hovering before finally resting one, warm and steady, on her shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort in words. His silence was the kind that said you're safe now without ever needing to form the sentence. She looked up at him through blurred vision, saw the calm in his face, the kind of strength that doesn't roar but holds like earth beneath your feet. Something in her chest loosened, a knot untying itself after too many years. Outside, the sound of hooves faded into distance. But beneath that fading noise, another sound began to rise, the murmur of townsfolk, the low hum of voices not condemning but standing watch. The neighbor's voice carried faintly through the walls, words she couldn't quite make out, but the tone told her enough. They weren't alone anymore. Daniel's hand slipped away, and for a moment she almost reached for it before stopping herself. He rose, moving to the door, his silhouette framed against the soft light of morning. He looked back at her once, his eyes steady, his voice quiet. "They'll be back." It wasn't fear in his tone, only certainty, and beneath it something else, resolve carved deep enough to weather whatever came next. The morning after the standoff broke soft and golden, the kind of light that made the prairie seem endless and forgiving. The cabin smelled of ash and milk, of a life cobbled together out of fear and hope. She woke to the sound of the twins stirring, their small cries threading through the air like questions. Daniel was already outside, the steady thud of an axe splitting wood marking the rhythm of another day. For a moment, she let herself believe the worst had passed, that maybe the world had finally decided to leave them in peace. But peace was a fragile thing. She saw it in the way Daniel's shoulders tensed when he came in the mud tracked on his boots that told of more riders passing too close in the night. He didn't speak right away. He set down the wood, wiped his hands on a rag, and met her eyes with a look that carried more truth than words. "They won't stop," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make the walls hear and brace themselves. He didn't deny it. He only glanced at the twins, their tiny fists waving in the air, and then back to her. "Then we don't either." The hours that followed were heavy with preparation. Daniel reinforced the door, his hands moving with quiet purpose. She packed what little they had into a worn satchel, though every fold of fabric felt like an admission that safety here was borrowed time. The twins sensed the shift. Their usual coos were replaced by soft whimpers, as if they understood the tension pressing against the cabin walls. When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of fire and ash, the sound came again, hoofbeats, more this time, a dark echo rolling across the land. She froze, clutching the girls to her chest. Daniel reached for the rifle, his jaw set in that steady line she'd come to know. The first voice outside was louder, meaner. "Bring her out. Bring our blood out before we take it." Daniel stepped to the door, his body a quiet wall between her and the voice. He didn't open it yet. He looked at her, really looked, as if memorizing her face in that dim light. "You trust me?" Her throat tightened. Trust was a language she was still learning, but she nodded anyway, because in that moment there was nothing else to do. He opened the door. The evening air rushed in, carrying the smell of dust and the weight of too many eyes. The in-laws stood there, more of them this time, the brother-in-law's face twisted into something feral. The woman stayed back, her mouth set in that thin line of victory she hadn't yet earned. Daniel's voice cut through the noise, calm as the earth beneath their boots. "She's not going with you. This ain't your fight," the brother-in-law snarled. "You think one man can stand against all of us?" Daniel lifted the rifle, not aiming it, just holding it with the ease of someone who understood what it meant. "I don't need to stand against all of you. Just long enough for the rest of them to see what you really are." He stepped aside then, just enough for her to be seen, standing in the doorway with the twins clutched to her chest. The gathered townsfolk, drawn again by the commotion, murmured behind the line of riders. Faces she barely knew were now turned toward her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something softer, something that looked almost like shame. She swallowed, her voice trembling as it rose above the hum. "These are my daughters. They are not curses. They are not yours. They are mine." The words felt like fire leaving her mouth, burning away the last of her fear. For a heartbeat, silence stretched over the land, heavy and waiting. Then the old neighbor's voice broke it, rough and certain. "She's right. Leave them be." Others followed, the murmur swelling into something stronger, a tide she hadn't expected. The brother-in-law's face shifted, the certainty draining from his eyes as the weight of the town pressed against him. Power built on cruelty falters when it meets a wall of witness. He spat into the dirt, the sound sharp in the stillness. "This ain't over." Daniel's voice was softer than the wind, but it carried. "It is if you walk away." For a long moment no one moved. Then, slowly, the brother-in-law turned his horse, muttering curses that no longer landed with force. One by one, the others followed, their retreat marked by the fading echo of hooves against the hard earth. The door closed behind them. The cabin seemed to sigh, the walls loosening their grip on fear. Her knees buckled, but she didn't fall this time. She stood there, breathing hard, the twins quiet against her as if they, too, understood what had shifted. Daniel set the rifle down and turned to her. His hands, calloused and steady, reached out, not to take, not to lead, but to simply rest over hers where they clutched the girls. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. "You're safe," he said quietly, and the words didn't sound like a promise. They sounded like a vow carved deep enough to last a lifetime. Her throat closed around the weight of it. She met his eyes, saw the quiet ache there, the loneliness she had begun to recognize as her own. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. He shook his head, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "I didn't bring you here to save you." His voice dipped lower, almost breaking on the next words. "I brought you here because I think you were meant to save me." The tears came then, not from fear, not from relief, but from something deeper, hope cracking open inside her chest. She leaned into him, the twins between them, their small breaths binding the moment into something holy. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and quiet, the last light of day washing over it like a blessing. For the first time, the horizon didn't look like escape. It looked like home waiting to be built. In the stillness, his hand tightened gently over hers, and she realized that sometimes salvation didn't come in grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it came in the shape of a man standing steady at your door, saying softly, "You're coming with me," and meaning you'd never walk alone again.